Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary Parish. I'm Father Ron Sajak. I'm the fifth pastor in the history of the Nativity Parish here at Harris Hill, and we warmly welcome you. We at Nativity are now part of a parish family of parishes that includes St. Mary's in Swarmville. It includes Our Lady of Peace down the road on Main Street, and St. Teresa in Akron. So if you're from those parish churches, a very warm welcome to our new family members, as well as our good friends in Clarence and the vicinity. We welcome you all today. It is a pleasure to welcome back Bob Poczik to Nativity. Many of you maybe had been here just after the fire at Notre Dame, when Bob did a fabulous presentation on the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And so it is really great to have Bob present with us. I know Bob's desire some time ago was to do more research in the Vatican archives, and I wrote him a note that got him in. I don't know what kind of clout I had, but he was able to get in. However, COVID prevented that. Yeah, COVID closed down the archives in Rome. They were the epicenter, of course, in Italy at the time. So I don't think you ever got there, did you? Okay, maybe in the future we'll do Wonders of the Vatican Part 2. Okay. So with no further ado, we welcome our good friend Bob Passley.
Well, good evening, everyone. Mark Jankowiak and I, who is here tonight, had a very wonderful trip to Rome planned, in which I would be able to do research in the Vatican Library. We would have access to parts of the Vatican archives that people don't ordinarily get to see, and everything was all set. And then the pandemic hit, and one by one, first the archives closed, then the library closed, then the Vatican closed, then Italy closed. And that was it for the trip. But what I want to say is anyone who travels to Rome, and regardless of his or her faith, is certain to visit the Vatican and St. Peter's Basilica. For Christians, they represent St. Peter, the rock on which the church was built. Some of us have been privileged to visit the Vatican. Others of us, it's a hope and a dream that we might someday do so. In preparing this program, I've been to the Vatican twice. I was struck by its many wonders and discovered things that I didn't know, some of which I found to be surprising, intriguing, and inspiring. I hope you will too. So let's begin with the Vatican as we know it today. This is an iconic site. There is no other building in the world that could be mistaken for the Vatican and St. Peter's. It's so beautiful, it's so remarkable. And we're going to explore lots of different parts of the Vatican and St. Peter's Basilica. But first, I want to put things in historical context by looking at a brief timeline of the Roman Empire. This is a very brief timeline of the Roman Empire. It starts over here on the left in 27 BC, considered to be the beginning of the Roman Empire. That's when Caesar Augustus became the first Roman emperor. Yes, we know Caesar Augustus from Luke's telling of Jesus' birth. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. That's that St. Augustus in 27 BC. If we go to the far right of the timeline, you'll see the date 476, which is considered to mark the fall of ancient Rome. There are two other dates just to the little bit to the left side. In 306 AD, Constantine became emperor. In 380 AD, Christianity was declared to be the sole religion in Rome. Right in between these two dates, Constantine becoming emperor and Christianity being the faith in Rome, was when the first St. Peter's was consecrated in the year 360. Yes, the first St. Peter's, for the one that we see today and know today, is the second and much newer St. Peter's. So what was there before there was a St. Peter's? Well, Rome was there. Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire. So all the buildings there were Roman. What was called the Circus of Nero, this is an illustration of the Circus of Nero. Now, the circus in Rome was not a circus the way we know it today, but was a large oval racing track for chariots. If anyone has seen the movie Ben-Hur, and I bet nearly everybody in the room has, you know what a circus is. You see all the chariots racing around this long oval racetrack. This circus had a very sad meaning for Christians. It was the site of the first organized state-sponsored martyrdom of Christians. This included the crucifixion of St. Peter, here shown in a painting by Caravaggio. St. Peter, as you may know, was crucified upside down. At his request, he wanted to be lesser than Christ, so he chose to be crucified in a more difficult way even. Now, the location of St. Peter's tomb is located in the area of the Circus of Nero. So what I did to give you some sense of this, the Circus of Nero is shown in green. You can see the long oval racetrack. Behind it is the Vatican and St. Peter's. And you can see that the Vatican and St. Peter's was actually built on top of the Circus of Nero. So the Circus of Nero had to be destroyed. And what happened, as they often do in that instance, they used some of the stone from the Circus of Nero to help build the first St. Peter's Basilica. It was consecrated in the year 360. This is an illustration of the first St. Peter's Basilica. It doesn't look anything like the current St. Peter's Basilica. The Emperor Constantine had it erected and consecrated in the year 360. The basilica was sited so that its apse was directly over Peter's tomb. Currently, Peter's tomb is directly below the high altar in the center of St. Peter's Basilica. I'll show you that later. Just want to point out to you, but this will come later. If you see this obelisk here, that's the obelisk that today is in the center of St. Peter's Square. And I'll tell you how it got moved there, which is quite a story. Building is in the ancient Roman style, rectangular, peaked roofs. There's an illustration of what it looked like inside. It was tall, it was narrow, it was long. This St. Peter's, the old St. Peter's, remained in use for more than 1,000 years. Here's an illustration of it in the year 1450, more than 1,000 years after it was first developed. You can see it looks sort of like it looked originally, but the city grew up around it, and other buildings surrounded it. It's in the middle of Rome. It was in very bad shape after 1,000 years. It had been neglected. Parts of it were in ruin. The church knew that it needed to be replaced. What happened is in the 1500s, the Renaissance was in full swing, and there were brilliant architects and artists and designers available to the Pope. So Pope Julius II made the decision to tear the old St. Peter's down completely, the same way that the Circus of Nero was torn down. The old St. Peter's Basilica was torn down, and they used some of the stone from the old St. Peter's Basilica to build the new one, which is the one we know of today. Doesn't look a bit like the old St. Peter's. This is Renaissance style. Now, I want to put, before we go inside the Basilica, I want to put this in a geopolitical perspective. The Pope came to control large amounts of territory in what is now the country of Italy. They were called the Papal States. They're shown on the map in purple. You can see this is the country of Italy. The Pope had control over those parts of Italy that were called the Papal States. This is a map of 2078. There were a lot of wars at the time, and the Pope and his armies did not do very well, and they were beginning to lose control of the Papal States. Eventually, all the Pope had left was St. Peter's and a few surrounding buildings. Pope Pius IX was furious and declared in 1860, "This corner of the earth is mine. I received it from Christ." Tough negotiating position the Pope put Italy in. So for 60 years, no Pope set foot outside the Vatican. It was a cold war of sorts between the Catholic Church and the country of Italy. But eventually, the Pope had no option but to settle. I mean, Italy was becoming a country, and in 1929, the Church and the government of Italy signed what are called the Lateran Pacts. At the time of the signing of the Lateran Pacts, the Church is, I might characterize it this way, land rich and cash poor. The Church was essentially bankrupt, but it had all these parts of Italy that they still had some ownership over. As a result of the Lateran Pacts, the Church became land poor. It gave up all the land, but cash rich. Italy recognized the Vatican as a sovereign state. They created it as an independent nation, and they compensated the Church $92 million, which is more than $1 billion in today's money. These funds form the basis of the treasury of the Catholic Church, which is estimated to be between $10 and $15 billion today. Now, if the man in the suit at the right signing the pacts looks familiar, it was none other than Benito Mussolini, who governed Italy from 1923 onward, made an ill-fated compact with Adolf Hitler, died at the hands of his own people. So the Vatican is now a sovereign city-state. This is a map of Vatican City. You'll see that it includes a number of buildings and also a great deal of open space for gardens. Slightly more than half of the Vatican's territory consists of gardens. So what does it mean to be a city-state? First of all, the Vatican is the smallest country in the world, both by size and by population. It has a 2-mile border with Italy. It's just about over 100 acres. The Pope is the absolute monarch of the Vatican. It's considered a theocracy. It issues its own euros, its own stamps, its own passports, and its own license plate. There are about 600 citizens at any given time of the Vatican, including 100+ members of the Swiss Guard. Now, to give you a sense of what a 2-mile border is like, which is the border of the Vatican, it takes about 45 minutes to walk around it from one place back to the other. So you can see it's relatively small. At 100 acres, it's about 1/8 the size of Central Park in New York City. In other words, you could fit 8 Vaticans in Central Park in New York City. Of its approximate 600 citizens, at any given time, half of them are serving outside the Vatican, largely in diplomatic positions in countries around the world. They took a census of those in residence at the Vatican in 2011, and they found out this. It included 71 cardinals who were living there, 51 members of the clergy, 1 nun, and 109 members of the Swiss Guards. Swiss Guards must be born in Switzerland and hold dual citizenship while in service at the Vatican. So here's a little roadmap for the next part of the program. We're first going to look at St. Peter's Basilica from the outside, then we'll look at it from up above, then we'll go inside, and then we'll go below. Let's first start out in St. Peter's Square, which is directly in front of the Basilica. Now, as you can see, it's a bit of a misnomer to call it a square because it is oval in shape. Hidden among the paving stones, there is a simple clock and calendar. All you need is a sunny day and the obelisk. The 83-foot stone obelisk in the middle of the square serves as a sundial that can accurately indicate midday and the two solstices. At capacity for major events, it can hold up to 300,000 people. The square is framed by two long colonnades of Greek columns completed in 1667, said to represent the outstretched arms of Mother Church. There are statues on top of the colonnades overlooking the square, 140 statues representing figures of saints. A large statue of St. Peter faces the square. Directly above the center of the front of the basilica stand three statues. In the center is Jesus, St. Andrew is on his left, and St. John the Baptist is on his right. At the center of the square stands an Egyptian obelisk made of red granite. It is one of 13 obelisks in the city of Rome, the most of any city in the world. In our country, Washington, D.C. has one, the Washington Monument. In Buffalo, we have one at Niagara Square. So why so many obelisks in Rome? 13. Well, they were spoils brought back to Rome when the Roman Empire conquered and ruled Egypt. They raided Egypt of antiquities and things to bring back to the city of Rome. This obelisk was originally erected at Heliopolis in Egypt, means the city of the sun. It's estimated to be 4,000 years old. Can you imagine that? 4,000 years old. It beggars the imagination. Now, the ancient Egyptians regarded them as symbols of the sun god Ra. This obelisk was brought to Rome by the Emperor Caligula in 37 BC. Transporting it was a major effort and required a special ship to be built that was 240 feet long. This is an illustration of what that ship might have looked like. Now, it's not really an accurate illustration. It gives you a sense of size of the obelisk and how to bring it. The actual ship was loaded with 1,000 tons of lentils. They packed the lentils all around the obelisk to protect it so it wouldn't crack or anything on the journey. They get to Rome with the obelisk. I figured, what did they do with 1,000 tons of lentils? The people of Rome must have gotten tired at some point of eating so much lentil soup. So they brought the obelisk to Rome, placed it at the center of the Circus of Nero that I told you about in the beginning. The obelisk was right in the center of the Circus of Nero. Circus of Nero was all demolished. The old Vatican was built, and it stood in that same place until Pope Sixtus had it moved to its current site in the center of Vatican Square in 1585. It was a Herculean effort to move this obelisk. It's as tall as a six-story office building. It's absolutely huge. They had to create a special framework to raise it. Once they got it there, they had to raise it until it was erect and set it in place. It took 13 months to accomplish the move and setting up of the obelisk, required the combined efforts of more than 900 workmen and 140 horses. Now, they had a slight problem. This was a monument to the sun god Ra. Therefore, it was a pagan monument situated in the middle of St. Peter's Square in front of the Vatican, so they had to do an exorcism to get rid of any spirits that might be in the obelisk. And there's an exorcism inscribed on the obelisk. If you visited, you might not have noticed it. It's inscribed on the east and west sides of the obelisk. Translated, it means, Christ wins, Christ reigns, Christ rules, may Christ defend his people against any evil. So the obelisk is the oldest object in St. Peter's Square, 4,000 years old. Here is the newest, a sculpture installed in September 2019 called Angels Unawares. When it was placed in St. Peter's Square, the Pope blessed it. It was erected on the annual World Day of Migrants and Immigrants and Refugees. There are 140 figures crammed together on this small boat. Why 140? That's the number of statues in the colonnades that surround St. Peter's Square. The inspiration for the statue came from Hebrews 13:2. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Sculpture was created by a Canadian artist, Timothy Schmalz. He works just north of us in Ontario. We should invite him down sometime. He's a near neighbor of ours, a talented sculptor. We'll come back to him later in the program. While we're out in the square, I need to tell you that the Pope holds a general audience there every Wednesday morning when he is not traveling. That's what it looks like. It's far from a private audience. Thousands of people attend each general audience. Admission is by ticket. When the Pope has finished speaking, he is driven around the square in what has come to be known as the Pope-mobile, so he can more directly address and greet the people who are present. And as you can imagine, it's very exciting for people to see the Pope smiling and reaching out his hand close at hand. Now, before we go inside the Basilica, let's take a short jaunt to the Castel Sant Angelo. This is also one of the most popular tourist sites in Rome. It originally was a mausoleum built by the Emperor Hadrian in 139 AD, served as a burial place for several Roman emperors. It was converted to a fortress in the early Middle Ages. Throughout the Middle Ages, it served as a refuge for popes in time of trouble. Here's a view. This is looking at St. Angelo from the Vatican perspective. Let's look at a view from St. Angelo back. If you're in the Castel St. Angelo, this is the scene that you get going back toward the Vatican. Now, I want to point out something in the lower right hand of the slide. It's a kind of a tall, narrow wall there. It's more than a wall. It's an elevated, covered passageway called the Passetto. It served as an escape route for popes when they needed to seek safety in the Castel Sant'Angelo. Pope Clement VII used it in 1527 to flee from the invading mercenaries of the Holy Roman Emperor. They sacked Rome. They murdered priests and nuns. The Swiss Guard had to fight a rear guard action to give the Pope time to escape through the Passetto to get to the Castel Sant'Angelo. More than 100 of the Swiss Guard lost their lives in that battle. The only problem was they forgot to stock the Castel Sant'Angelo with any provisions. So the Pope and his retinue were there, and they had nothing to eat. So they essentially had to negotiate a peace rather quickly. I want to show you this shows the route of the, here's the Passetto from the Castel Sant'Angelo all the way over to the Vatican, where it ends at the Pope's bedroom. And that's where the door is. So that's what the Pope ever needs to make an emergency exit. That is the way that he does. Now, before we enter the Basilica, let's visit the Vatican Gardens in the rear of the Basilica. I told you that the Vatican Gardens occupy about half of the land space in the Vatican. They date back to medieval times, but were expanded during the Renaissance. This is a view looking down at the gardens from the dome. You can actually see the shadow of the dome of St. Peter's reflected here. The gardens were never open to the public. No one ever got to go to them, except in 2014, Pope Francis opened the gardens for the first time, and now people can tour the gardens. They're really beautiful. Here, I'll show you several views. I mean, parts of the garden are formal in their design. You can see the dome of St. Peter's in the distance. Some parts are more informal and natural. There's even running water in the gardens and streams. Very special is a replica of the grotto at Lourdes. As close as they could reconstruct it and make it, they brought it here in the Vatican Gardens. Now let's go above to the great dome of the Basilica. This is St. Peter's dome. Michelangelo designed this dome when he was 71 years old. So don't let it be said that senior citizens cannot do remarkable accomplishments. He died at 89 before it was completed, and he refused all fees. It was, he said, an offering to God. The dome is 448 feet high and has a diameter of 138 feet. To give you some comparison, think of the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. is 288 feet high. The one at St. Peter's is 448 feet high, so it's much higher. That's as tall as a 40-story office building. We'll look at the interior of the dome, which is beautiful. I mean, this is a view of the dome from below. It was a marvelous creation of Michelangelo, a huge gift to the world. And he was inspired in designing the dome by the Pantheon in Rome. Pantheon is almost 2,000 years old. It's the best preserved Roman building in existence. One of the reasons it's lasted so long is that it's made of concrete. So it stood the test of time. So Michelangelo had the idea of the dome based on the dome of the Pantheon, but he respected the Pantheon so much that he intentionally made the Basilica dome 5 feet shorter than the dome of the Pantheon. Pantheon has no windows, only one doorway to get in. It was formerly a Roman temple. It's now a church. It's open to the public. We can look inside and see. There's a large round opening at the top of the dome. It's called an oculus, or eye. It's 30 feet wide. It's very wide, open to the elements. There's no glass. There's nothing that covers it. When it rains, the rain comes through the eye. When it snows, the snow comes through the eye. The floor in the Pantheon is slightly tilted outward so that if any water accumulates, it drains off to the side of the flooring. Let's now go to the Basilica. This is a diagram of the layout of the Basilica. Here, if you think, here's St. Peter's Square. You walk up from St. Peter's Square up the steps to the entrance of St. Peter's Basilica. There's a large atrium at the beginning. Then there's a long nave. And on each side of the nave are altars and statues, including the Pietà by Michelangelo. If you keep walking down the nave, there are 2 side areas. It's in a cruciform, a cross form. At the center of the cross point of the cross is the main altar. Only the Pope can serve Mass at the main altar. If you continue on, you come to the apse of the church. The main altar is under the dome. So when the light comes in, it comes down on the main altar. Let's look at another view of the... St. Peter's is so breathtaking for visitors and to see. I mean, the ceilings are so high overhead, and they're curved, and there's sculpture and paintings everywhere the eye goes. And the light from the dome streams down into the church. I have to show you a very important structure. If you before we go to the next slide, if you can see this structure here is called a Baldachin, and let's look at it more closely in the next slide. This is a closer view of the Baldachin. You can see it's located at the cross points of the nave. 4 tall pillars. It was designed and built by Bernini, who was the leading sculptor in the Renaissance, in the Baroque style. So it's very elaborate. The gigantic columns are 66 feet high as a 6-story office building. You have to think of what that means. They use a twisty, helical spiral shape that they believe was used in the original Solomon's temple. It was the columns there were described, so they decided to do that here. It took 9 years to build the Baldachin. Baldachin is something that covers a holy space. In a simpler form, you can see it in the traditional cloth canopy, that when the Pope travels in other countries, they hold what is a Baldachin over the Pope, so that the one designed by Bernini is the same thing, except much bigger and more elaborate. This was when Pope Francis visited Armenia. Let's look at the interior again. This is the central altar that I told you was directly below the dome, and is the altar that only the Pope is allowed to say Mass at. Directly below the altar is the tomb of St. Peter. And we'll go down there in a little bit. But let's look beyond the papal altar at the apse of the church. At the apse stands what's called the throne of St. Peter. That's here. It is not occupied. It's ceremonial. It's wooden. It was carved in the Middle Ages. It was placed in elaborate Baroque metalwork created by Bernini. It's very spectacular. Just behind it is what's called the dove window. It has 12 principal rays emanating from the dove that represent the 12 apostles. Now let's go below the basilica. This is a diagram of St. Peter's. Here's the Baldachin that you looked at earlier. Here's the main altar that the Pope does Mass at. Right in front of the altar are stairs that go down to 2 levels. Level 1 immediately below the basilica, and level 2 more recently excavated that is below that. That bottom level is called the necropolis. It's been excavated. It actually dates back to the time of Peter and the early Christians. They hid. They had to hide. They were outlaws and rebels, so they needed a place. So in a sense, when they created, these were caves and hidden areas, and it's where they met. It's where they celebrated the Eucharist. It's where Christians were buried. It's where they held the important documents that they had. Let's look at another view. It's very rough. They didn't do much restoration of it, just cleaned it up. Some of the places are burial sites. The next slide shows the area in the rear that is believed to be the place where St. Peter is buried. No one is allowed to go down that corridor to that area. It is closed off. It is considered to be holy space. Pope Francis, when he became Pope, visited the necropolis, but I don't think they let him go down that pathway to the tomb of St. Peter. He's standing, sort of looking at it as the way we might. Now, what you might wonder is, if St. Peter is buried beneath the basilica in this area, did they find his bones? How do they know that St. Peter was buried there? They do have bone fragments that are preserved in a very special metal box. They were dated. They were carbon dated to that period. They believe they could very legitimately be the bones of St. Peter's. If we open the box and look inside, this is what you find. These are the bone fragments that are believed to be the bones of St. Peter that rest in a cushioned area and are held in place. Now, are the bones of St. Peter at the Basilica? No longer. The Pope brought the box out to the square, displayed it to pilgrims, and gave it all the honor, and then gifted the bones to Bartholomew, the Orthodox Patriarch, as a sign of unity and peace between the Eastern and Western churches. Now, before we go to the Sistine Chapel, I want to share something with you that very few people. The Sistine Chapel is probably the best known part of St. Peter's Basilica. This is the least known part of St. Peter's Basilica. It's called the Tower of the Winds. It was built in 1580. It is one of the Vatican's best kept secrets because it is part of the secret archives of the Vatican that is not open to the public. This was, when Mark Jankowiak and I planned our trip to Rome, we had managed to get an invitation to visit the Tower of the Winds, which is not given to anyone. It was just Father Ron opened the door for us with his letter that he wrote to Rome, saying that I was doing legitimate research for the Diocese of Buffalo and asking for permission. That letter was translated into Italian, and so all the letters back and forth to the Vatican are in Italian, very high level of Italian. One thing led to the next, and we prepared a letter to a cardinal, who is a cardinal from Portugal. He's 35 years old. He was appointed by Pope Francis. He will be in the conclave that elects the new pope, the next pope. He could be the Pope himself some days from now. He's only 35 years old. If I tell you the letter to the cardinal, the only way these letters could be prepared is my wife's sister is married to a very well-educated Italian man. He did all of the translation, and he said, Bob, the language that I am using is so elevated. When you're addressing a cardinal, you don't use normal Italian. It's a very old, elaborate, honorific form of Italian. And that cardinal gave permission for Mark and me to go to the Tower of the Winds, which we were not able to do, unfortunately. So this is the Tower of the Winds. This is a painting that was done at the time. Tower of the Winds is still there. This is what it looks like. It doesn't look as pretty as in the painting. It looks sort of concrete. If you were visiting the Vatican, you wouldn't even notice it. It might look like air conditioning sort of thing. I mean, why would you even pay any attention to this? But it is this marvelous 3-story structure that might be drab on the outside, but it is gorgeous on the inside. It has, the walls and the ceiling are covered with the most beautiful and elaborate murals. This is a reconstruction and illustration. At one point in time, there was a small hole in one of the walls that was used as part of the astronomical work of the Vatican, and they used that, but they had other instruments of the day. This was a big issue for the church at this time. When Julius Caesar was the leader of Rome, he created the Julian Calendar. That was a calendar. He was the one that said January, February, March, April to 365. Created that whole calendar. It was a Roman creation. The Pope was very dissatisfied with it, particularly Pope Gregory XIII. The problem was Pope Gregory assembled the best astronomers of the day to actually see if they could update the Julian calendar. Now, the men that he convened at this time still believed that the sun and the stars and the planets revolved around the earth. They hadn't sort of gotten the idea that the earth is not the center of the universe, but they still were very talented men, and they used that hole in the Tower of the Winds and other instruments, and they concluded that the Julian calendar had fallen 10 days behind over 1,600 years. 10 days behind, which meant that the church was celebrating religious holidays on the wrong days because the calendar was out of date. So Pope Gregory said, enough of this, we're making a new calendar. The Gregorian calendar, it was issued in 1582. The Pope said, guess what? This is the calendar we're going to use from now on. Everybody had to have one. Nobody had calendars at that. Everybody had to have a Gregorian calendar. This calendar is essentially the same one that we use today. It was that was developed in 1582. Now they had a problem. They had those 10 days that were missing like that. So they had a very simple but ingenious solution, which is shown here. This is a reconstruction of what took place in the month of October. On the left-hand side is the Julian calendar. On the right is the Gregorian calendar. If you follow along, October 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 15th. They just sort of said, we're declaring that the day after October 4th is October 15th, and in one fell swoop, they took care of that and took care of those 10 days. Now, you might think that these days the Vatican is out of the observatory business, but as a matter of fact, the Vatican maintains a state-of-the-art telescope in the United States, in Southeast Arizona, in partnership with the University of Arizona. It's probably the most far-flung kind of possession of the Vatican. Now let's go to the Sistine Chapel, which for many visitors is the highlight of their time there. Now, this is not a view that you usually see of the Sistine Chapel. We usually see it in the inside, but it has an outside. It's a building. It looks like this. It's an old Roman-style building, long and rectangular with a peaked roof. Doesn't look anything like the rest of the Vatican. It was commissioned by Pope Sixtus. It named it after him, Sistine Chapel. It was built when the old St. Peter's Basilica still stood. So it was part of the old St. Peter's Basilica. When they destroyed the old St. Peter's Basilica, they kept the Sistine Chapel. And what they did was they incorporated it and built the rest of St. Peter's and the Vatican around it. It cannot be seen. Nobody sees it. You can't see it. This is the only view from an upper window in the Vatican, a window in a place of the Vatican that tourists cannot come. But I want you to see what this, we're going to pay a lot of attention to the inside, but this is what it looks like from the outside. When it was built, Michelangelo was only 6 years old. It would be 27 more years before he was reluctantly persuaded by Pope Julius to paint its ceiling. This is what the inside of the Sistine Chapel looked like before Michelangelo. It was a vaulted ceiling, 65 feet high. That's as high as a 6-story office building. It served as a private chapel for the Pope and as a gathering place for cardinals of the Catholic Church to elect a new Pope. Same as is done today. It's in use today as it was designed to be. Now, the original ceiling, this is a photograph. The description of it is that it was dark blue with gold stars. So this is just one. I mean, there are churches today that have this. I think there's several in Buffalo that have midnight blue ceilings with gold stars in them, and that was what the original Sistine Chapel looked like. Now let's bring Michelangelo onto the scene. Michelangelo was a tough character. He was very brusque, very independent, very stubborn. He was 33 years old, and Pope Julius said he wanted him to paint murals on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and Michelangelo refused. Now, people don't usually refuse a request from the Pope, but Michelangelo did. He said, I am a sculptor. I'm not a painter. The Pope wanted the ceiling to have frescoes of the 12 apostles. His idea was there would be 12 murals on the top, each one of a different apostle. Well, you can see that's not a very dramatic kind of painting to have. You've got 12 men. Now you would put them in different clothing, you might give them different symbols that they might carry that represented who they were, but Michelangelo thought that was a very poor thing. This was not worthy of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He threatened to leave Rome when the Pope pressured him. Finally, the Pope agreed to let Michelangelo select the subject matter. And Michelangelo said, if I can select the subject matter, I will paint the ceiling. And he selected 9 scenes from the book of Genesis. Now, there's a popular misconception we have to deal with first. Michelangelo did not paint the ceiling lying flat on his back. He erected scaffolding that allowed him to paint standing up. Now, before we come to his painting of the ceiling, let's get a full view of the Sistine Chapel as it exists today, showing the ceiling, the windows, and the walls. It's a phenomenal creation. It is very tall, as tall as a 6-story office building, so it's very tall, very narrow. There are windows on both sides, there are murals, and there are 9 frescoes along the top, which are the centerpiece of what Michelangelo created. Now, these are frescoes. First, I have to say something about what a fresco is. Fresco is when fresh plaster is laid, and while it is still wet, the artist paints the colors and paints the drawing on the wet plaster. When the wet plaster dries, it fixes the paint, and it preserves the paint so it can be kept. The work had to be done very quickly. This was not, you couldn't spend a lot of time because the plaster's drying while you're making up your mind. If you make a mistake, guess what? You have to chip all of the plaster off the wall and start over again by laying fresh plaster. So you really tried to get it right the first time. On both sides of the central frescoes, which I'll show you, are a series of Old Testament prophets and pagan oracles, such as the Libyan Sibyl. I picked this one because I think it's a good illustration of how three-dimensional Michelangelo's work was. He was a sculptor primarily. In a sense, it's been said that Michelangelo painted sculptures. He thought that way. He thought three-dimensionally. Now, let's look straight up at the full ceiling overhead. You can see you almost could get a bit of vertigo from looking up and a crick in your neck because you're looking straight up 60 feet to the ceiling, and it's almost dizzying. There's so much going on. It is such a magnificent creation. It was all painted by one man. To me, that's a miracle. I think it is the world's greatest masterpiece. I think it is divinely inspired. So Michelangelo had 9 of these frescoes to paint on the ceiling. The first one he painted was of Noah and the flood. He spent a lot of time on this. This was the very first one that he created. He was very pleased with it until he removed the scaffolding, went down to the floor, and looked up and said, "The figures are too small. There are too many of them. You can't see them." I mean, sometimes from the back of this room, you might have difficulty making all the figures out. It was a big mistake on his part. He wasn't going to do it all over, which would have been a terrific task, but he learned from it. And he remedied that. And an example of that is the fresco of Adam and Eve, tempted by the serpent and being expelled from the garden. You can see the figures are bigger, there are fewer of them. He now was painting, thinking from the viewpoint of the floor, people looking something up at the ceiling. Michelangelo intentionally saved paintings in which God appeared until his mastery of the painting of frescoes had matured. He saved it until he felt he was talented. The result was worth the wait. I mean, this is God creating Adam, probably the most iconic painting in all of Western art. It's just a a wonderment, just a phenomenal thing. Now I have to tell you, because all of the scenes are from the Old Testament, Jesus does not appear in any of the frescoes, right? I mean, this is the way it is. It has been speculated that one of the children in the flowing cloak of God may represent Jesus. You can see that as God stretches out his right arm to bring life to Adam, his left arm and his hand is resting on the shoulder of this young child. And it's thought that maybe that was Michelangelo's way of showing that Jesus always existed and was always with the Father and had not yet made his appearance in the world. Now, Michelangelo took 4 years to paint the ceiling. He was 33 years old when he started. He was 37 when he finished. I want to show you two different views of the ceiling. This is what it would look like if you were there. I mean, if you were there, you'd be one of the people on the ground. There would be other people around you. You'd be looking up. You can see how high overhead it is. Now, I think that the man in the left-hand side looks a lot like Monsignor Fred Lysing. I can't say that it's him for sure. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But I thought you'd want to get there. If you were there, this is sort of what it would look like. Then another very intriguing view. This was created by a graphic designer. What they said was, imagine that the roof of the Sistine Chapel was transparent. If it were, it's not transparent. If it were transparent, this is how the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel would be spread from one end of the building to the other. Now, Michelangelo was not yet done with the Sistine Chapel. He returned a quarter century later, 25 years later, at the request of another pope, to paint a monumental depiction of the Last Judgment on the wall of the chapel in back of the altar. This, the Last Judgment. Michelangelo was 61. Remember, he was in his 30s when he first did the painting. Now he's 61 years old. Took him 7 years until he was 68. This was a dark period for the Catholic Church, and it's been reflected in the sense of the last days and the Last Judgment. Rome had been sacked in 1527. That's when the Pope had to flee along the Passetto to the Castel Sant Angelo. The Reformation was taking place in Northern Europe. There was a growth of Protestantism. The church was splintering, and it was felt that this had the gravity to illustrate this very difficult period. The basic design is spectacular. The murals across the ceiling are much smaller than this. This is one huge mural, all done in fresco style, beautiful blue background. Jesus is in the center. We'll look closer at him in a moment. And the basic design is he's bringing people who have died up to heaven and sending people who have died down to hell. This was the Last Judgment. Let's take a little closer look. This is the figure of Jesus in the center of the fresco with his mother Mary nestled under his right arm. So I think it's an interesting depiction of Jesus. First of all, he's beardless, which is very rare in paintings or sculpture. He's also very full-figured. I mean, he's not emaciated and tortured. This is Jesus in heaven. If you look closely, you can see nail holes in the 2 feet and a wound in the center. I can't make out the 2 nail holes in the hands, but I'm sure they are there. So he is lifting his right arm, bringing people up to heaven, lowering his left arm, sending people to hell. Being sent to hell was a dark experience. The people would know the meaning of this from Dante's Inferno: abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Next 2 sections of the painting come from the descent into hell. Dark indeed. Despair hopelessness, anxiety, fear, grief, all typify the people sentenced to hell. Here's another view. At the bottom, the ferryman taking people into hell, and the expressions on the faces are painful to look at because it was such a traumatic and painful experience that is being depicted here. But I don't want to end the view of the wall with those sentenced to hell, so here is an image of those brought up to heaven. This is very different. People are being lifted, they're being reunited with God, they're going to heaven. Now, we're coming to the end of the program, and I want to leave you with this thought. Beyond history, which we've been dealing with, beyond science, facts, and words, there is art. Art is perhaps the truest path to the deepest parts of ourselves and to God. Now we're going to experience this through the art form of sculpture. Sculpture is very powerful. It is three-dimensional. It's very tangible. It's very visceral, maybe the most visceral of all art forms. We're going to look at 4 sculptures by the Canadian artist Timothy Smaltz, who lives north of us in Ontario, that are situated at various locations in Rome. And then we'll end with the sublime and profoundly moving Pietà, created by Michelangelo when he was only 24 years old. Thank you, Maureen. That was so beautiful. That's the end of our program, Wonders of the Vatican. I had such a wonderful time putting it together. I hope you had a good time being here tonight to see it. So I will just say, God bless you and good night. We have a special little treat to, first of all, I want to tell you the piece of music you heard, I believe, is the Largo from the New World Symphony by Dvorak, sometimes called Going Home. And we thought that it was appropriate here because Jesus was going home to the Father. You are now going home. And Maureen's daughter, Rose, who is a budding violinist in the footsteps of her mother, with a little assistance from her mother, is going to give you a last serenade of going home as you get ready to depart.